Chapter 2. The party crashes. The last wisps of warm air dissipated quickly. The only thing the hunter could see with the thermal goggles was his own vague silhouette. Whatever heat the metal suit had stored faded away in moments. One thing was for certain, there was nothing natural about this cold. It was suffering and despair faultlessly tortured. He was now thrust into absolute darkness. The last stream of light had died with the closing of the secret door. The first seeds of doubt that had been planted earlier took root in his resolve and began to grow. He took a moment to make full evaluation of his senses. All the smells of the bar were still present here, the aromas of stale beer, perfume, cigarettes, ammonia, and maybe even sulfur still lingered. However, there was a new odor. It smelled strong and pungent. It smelled like death in all its stages and forms. The idea that he had jumped out of the frying pan into the fires of hell did occur to him at this juncture. Amazingly, his inner voice had no comment on his current dilemma. Maybe it just had no useful suggestions to offer. Or somehow it had found a way out of his psyche and into more pleasant surroundings. He thought it to be the latter because when it had no useful suggestions it was always content to spend endless hours just overstating the obvious. The hunter fumbled around on his belt until he found what he wanted. The small cold space was filled with blinding light. Even with the goggles' radiance filter, it required a moment for his eyes to adjust. Shining the beam of the flashlight against the back of the sliding panel, he saw the knothole button pushed along narrow rod. Not knowing if knocking the rod down would open or lock the door, he decided to try ripping it from the wall. He was pulling hard with his gloved hand when he heard a sound from below. What sounded like a slide and slap caused him to aim the flashlight down the steps. Spinning quickly, he turned, drew the knife and opened it with one easy, well-practiced motion. He could see no movement, but there was a sticky red path. He remembered the blood trail that had led him here. He took a moment to examine his handiwork before proceeding. The rod did not break, but it had bent enough to lend a little optimism to the lone hunter. The sound came again. First a sliding sound that brought to his mind an image of a duffel bag being dragged across concrete. The slapping sound had no mundane point of comparison. However, it had a respectable DOSOM rating. The hollow sound was magnified by the impact it made with the cold rough stone of the uncomfortably tight stairway. Moving cautiously, he descended in the direction of the sound and the smell of unpleasant things. He moved tactically with the large knife at the ready. Step after step, he went deeper into the earth. Did people in China say dig until you reach New Jersey? He had never heard that particular phrase, but if he ever got out of here, he would ask about it. The path was disorientating to him. The winding stairs seemed to go down forever. He could not tell if he was getting closer to the sound or if it was growing more distant. The echoes were confusing his ears, almost as much as the winding stairs confused his eyes. The sliding sound continued even after the slaps seemed to have ended. The hard stone of the spiral staircase hurt his wounded foot with every step. Following horrific sounds in the direction of the smell of death should always give one cause for reflection. At times like this, you may desire to evaluate your decision-making methods. If you find yourself in situations like this on a regular basis, well, you may wish to stop into the nearest mental health clinic and inquire about a prescription for thorazine and padded accommodations. If not, there may just be an organization looking for you. He could not remember how many steps he had taken. Was it dozens or hundreds? He couldn't even estimate. The hunter was becoming certain that he was on Escher's ever-descending staircase. The effect of not being able to see either the top or the bottom of the stairway gave him a strange sense of vertigo. The further he descended, the tighter the walls became. And the steps seemed to be shrinking as well. The crude and rough steps and the entire passage were cut straight through the hard bedrock. The dark igneous rock that surrounded him absorbed the light he projected. The black stone radiated cold. He stopped for a moment and touched it with his gloved hand. Even through the metal glove, the rock felt cold. He thought it was draining his body heat and life all at the same time. Now he wished he would have stayed and witnessed what was coming through door number 1, or perhaps tried door number 3. A guarded back door seemed like a better option than this. No back door was worse than this, a dead end was preferable to a stairway to hell. The darkness always just outside of the bright beam of light looked like the shadows of demons. No matter how fast he pursued them with the bright point of light, they stayed just out of reach. He began to count the steps as he went further and further down. He decided counting the steps was not a good idea, and gave up the effort at 97. There was still no sign of it ending. Moving faster caused him to bounce off the cold walls time and again. His armor caught and snagged on the jagged rock. It only released after he stopped and pulled hard. After a hard jerk and a metallic moan, he would again be on his way. He pulled too hard and lost his footing. Luckily, the ground was there to catch him. The rock was unforgiving as he struck his head. Just touching the stone seemed to eat away at his resolve. Thoughts of the futility of his life and his ambitions soon found their way into his mind. His desperate psyche claimed his life was meaningless. There was no one to love him. There wasn't even anyone to mourn him when he was gone. Everyone he cared about had died. His mother and father had died years ago when she had still needed them. After that they had only had each other to fill the void left by their loss, but that time was too short. Now that she was gone, he had only one thing. Revenge. Revenge was the furnace in which he slowly incinerated all his pain. Slowly it would all be consumed in the bright glow. It glowed bright as it burned deep inside of him, powering the engine that he had become. Nothing else mattered now, not his work, not his dreams, and certainly not his life. Not that there was much people would call a life. Disregarding the discomfort, he was now taking the steps 2 or even 3 at a time. The implausible finally happened. He found something he had ceased to believe in. If he would have found the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, and Santa playing cards, it would have surprised him less than what he discovered. He had stopped believing in all those other things when he was 6. He had only given up hope of finding the bottom of the stairs moments ago. However, his disbelief in a bottom of the steps was much stronger than his disbelief in all the other stuff. It had taken too much time and he knew that this was not an escape. He came around the corner and exited the narrow corridor. He was suddenly overwhelmed by the cavernous void he entered. It made him feel like a small child in a world of giants. Darkness here was not merely the absence of light. It had evolved into a tangible presence. In this place, the pallium was thin and tattered like old parchment that would turn to dust at the lightest touch. The darkness that had been slumbering for so long stirred. He could feel the malice searching with a somnolence. The chamber towered around him on all sides. He could not see the other side of the enormous void. The walls seemed strangely smooth. tracing the black walls with the beam of light. He followed it upward. It went higher and higher until the beam was lost. This place had been used for many dark deeds. The stones he treaded on were covered with what looked like dried blood. This place was no sewer. However, from the sickening smell it must have been connected to one. The purpose of such a subterranean structure was as unclear as who could have built it. He was examining the cylindrical arrangement of stones that formed the high walls when he stepped in something sticky. He used the flashlight to illuminate the blood trail. And it was then he remembered himself. The fresher blood stood out garishly from all the older contributions. He turned off the flashlight and used the goggles to scan the room. It appeared empty at first glance. Reigniting the light, he used the beam to follow the glistening trail created by the fresh blood. Far across the large chamber, he saw movement. The dark form was crawling. It must have been the male creature that had escaped him. It was moving very quickly. The lifeless thrashing of more than half its body reminded the hunter of an eel caught on land at low tide. His nose wrinkled as the foul odor grew overwhelming. The sewer was near. The hunter had a burning in his mouth at the thought of following it into the deep pipes full of human excrement. Turning, he hoped to catch him before he could immerse himself in the foul substance. Then another smell reached him. Cool fresh air. From the opposite direction. The sound of banging came down the stairs and he paused to evaluate with the introduction of this third variable. Whatever was banging the hell out of the sliding panel. The fact that he had one magazine of ammo and his pump-action shotgun was foobar. The choice was clear. The hunter cursed to himself at letting this abomination see another night. His assignment had been to find the kid. The 6 damned were just the gravy. The hunter, however, did not take the assignments for the sake of the mission. For him it was all about the gravy. Resigned to his decision, he gave the retreating form one last curse and limped as fast as he could towards the cool breeze. The panel must have given way because as he reached the junction of the tunnel he could hear the sounds of heavy boots on the steps. He followed the cool damp breeze for a few twists and turns. He passed dozens of X and T junctions, only hesitating a moment to catch the taste of the fresher air. The tunnel narrowed from its comfortable 10 feet to a nearly claustrophobic 5 and was little more than a pipe. His almost 6-foot-tall body was uncomfortable as he moved through the tight cylindrical passage. The feeling of hope that was growing in him when he determined that he was ascending was killed. As he turned the final corner and found the tunnel had come to a sudden conclusion, he turned off the light and listened. He could hear a single pair of footsteps pursuing him. They seemed to be coming closer, then he thought they were growing distant. With all the echoes down here, he could not tell. He backed quietly to the wall when he felt cold metal pushing into him. With the knife in his hand, he spun and ignited the bright beam of light. The rebar that protruded from the wall formed a crude ladder. Shining the beam of the flashlight up, he thought he could see the top. He climbed as quietly as he could and tried to stifle his gasps of pain and discomfort. Trying to distract his mind, he counted the rungs as he climbed. This had the opposite effect after he reached the 50th step. And he reignited his light to check his progress. His goal now seemed further than when he began. He renewed his fortitude and continued vowing not to think of the top of the ladder again until he reached it. He was a machine. He was a beast. He was a marine, was the mantra he spoke to himself in a low growl. The words took over and the action became too easy. For him this was a way to turn off all but the most primal parts of his mind. The part of his mind that now took over had a limited vocabulary. Words like can't and shouldn't have no place here. He focused only on his task, and time, pain and confusion lost all their meaning. The climbing was exhausting and his muscles burned with the effort. The bag he carried was growing heavier as every moment passed. Dropping it was a possibility, as the equipment he would lose would not help him much if he died down here. However, the bag and the noise it would make if he dropped it would draw unwanted attention. He continued to climb as the debate raged in his head. He could hang the bag on one of the rungs he was climbing and, optimistically, he could return to retrieve it if he escaped. Things were growing fuzzy. The bag's nylon strap was pulling hard on his shoulder. He could feel it restricting blood flow. Every beat of his heart was painful and constricting. He did not know how much farther he could go. Regardless, his body was not giving in. It drove on without consulting his more advanced faculties. Legs lifted and arms pulled on and on. All the negative thoughts were as important to his body as the news on the radio was to a car driving down the highway. The thoughts were just irrelevant noise. He hit his head on something hard and cursed it for being in his way. In the utter darkness, he struck out and the sound of metal hitting metal resounded. Cursing again, he used the beam of the light to illuminate the manhole cover. He had been so focused on his task that he had forgotten the goal. He smiled and used his hand to move the cover. The thing would not budge. Not an inch. He took a moment to rest and regain his fortitude. He could hear voices, and was unsure if they came from above or below. He pointed the beam of the flashlight down and was struck with an overwhelming feeling of vertigo. The bright beam could not reach the bottom of the ladder, and that fact was unnerving. Losing his grip on the top rung, he desperately fought for stability. Finally, he was able to loop his arm through the thick metal and he steadied himself. After he regained some level of composure, he tilted his head and closed his eyes and listened. He was now convinced the voices came from below. He positioned himself in a crouch just below the manhole cover and with all the force he could muster rammed his shoulder into the unyielding surface. This effort resulted in a deep groan that should have been a good sign. It would have been if the sound had come from the cover. 3 more efforts were made with the same result and a few more colorful phrases. He was about to start the long climb down when he saw a distant point of light below him. Silently, he offered a prayer and with every muscle of his body. Not to mention the idea of what awaited him below. He exploded upward. The curses came again, along with a few opinions of the origin of the cover and its makers. It may have been the curses, or it may have been the fear. Or it may have even been the prayer he offered. It may have been a combination of all these factors. Regardless, the heavy metal disc yielded its defense of this point of egress. The hunter was unsure which factor was most prevalent, so he thanked God most of all. Just to be on the safe side. Climbing out, he took stock of his situation. This would not be his greatest success to date. But, in the spirit of optimism, this was an operation he could walk or limp away from. So it can't be all that bad. He looked around quickly and pushed the heavy metal cover back in place with his good foot and walked away fast. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out his neatly folded jacket. He put it on over his ripped and tattered shirt. There was little he could do about the blood-splattered pants right now. He was spreading his entire genetic sequence every time his wounded foot hit the pavement. The police do not usually hunt hunters, with the actions more often than not attributed to inexpiable pranks. The damned may try to hunt hunters, but that was rarely fruitful. They often have the attention spans of moments, not hours. Walking casually was not easy in his condition, but he managed the best he could. He hurried as fast as he could and stuck to the shadows as much as he was able. His mental map of the city was not clarifying his location. Nothing seemed to line up with the subterranean distance he had traveled. The wind picked up, scattering all types of detritus down and around. As a few discredited pages of a newspaper blew by, he stepped on it with his wounded foot. His concern of leaving a blood trail behind remained. So this trick gave him a little peace of mind. He is still searching for a familiar street sign, only with all the construction in the area it was nearly impossible to identify. The hunter took the advantage of the shadow provided by an alley that he was passing to duck in, catch his breath and determine his approximate location. He hugged the wall as he poked his head out of the mouth of the alley. Noting a familiar street didn't help, it only added to the confusion. However, this emotion was immediately replaced by shock. The manhole cover that had been his most recent point of egress from the darkness below the city suddenly exploded. The 50-pound slab of iron flew up to the sky, higher than you could spin a quarter with a slingshot. The considerable mass of the projectile seemed to become disjointed, not only from the laws of physics but time itself. The hunter watched it follow a strange arch over the tops of houses and office buildings. Mesmerized? What leapt into the sky directly behind made it seem almost mundane in comparison. The flowing shadow moved like it was equal parts black silk and sub-zero mercury. It too seemed to be out of sync with time, passing through without being part of. The shadow went into the sky without any apparent effort. So when it started to descend back to the ground, it did so without warning. It went from a slow rise, then moved, seeming to stop in midair, linger for a moment, then flow through itself, and instantly heading towards terra firma. It struck with force, yet without an audible effect. It seemed to land just over the hole from whence it came. To further demonstrate the total contrast, the manhole cover hit with nearly explosive force. The noise was deafening and the debris flew like shrapnel, forcing the hunter to take cover behind the wall. After a long moment, still engulfed in apprehension, he tentatively looked out from behind the wall. He saw the shadow scanning the area with an indefinable sense, not sight, smell or touch. It was in the light cast by the street lamp and still seemed to disappear in plain sight until it moved. When it moved in that formless way that it seemed there was still no discernible shape in the conventional meaning of the word. Arms and legs went from non-existent to 7 or 8 when it was crouched and looked like it was about to jump. The hunter waited for the wind to pick up and pulled the newspaper from his foot, and gave it to the wind. It continued down the sidewalk, and moments later, the shadow became very attentive, then sank into pool of shadow on the ground. Watching and waiting, the hunter let out a sigh of relief. Then the shadow exploded from the ground, running straight toward the shadows where the hunter was crouched with his hand on the pistol to give him comfort, only it didn't. The shadow cleared 20 meters in 2 leaps, and stopped trying to zero in on him. Then it suddenly stopped in the middle of the road, 10 meters from the mouth of the alley. It took a deep breath and it sounded like an old furnace strained to twice its intended capacity. The hunter nearly felt something pulling at the core of his being, pulling him towards the shadow. The sound continued and made time seem to slow, even the trash blowing down the street seemed affected, slowing and tumbling with indeterminate direction. He could feel his feet sliding on the rough asphalt towards the shadow. He moved, just incrementally closer to the shadow, out of the mouth of the dark alley and into its sight. Then as quickly as it started, the shadow moved to its right side effortlessly, and in a single leap cover 20 feet, apparently pursuing the blood-stained, discarded newspaper down the block. The hunter staggered as if an unseen force that he had been fighting against was just gone. The hunter bumped into a trash bin that started to fall over, causing a metallic clattering to reverberate up and down the alley. The hunter did not hesitate to see if it had caught the attention of the shadow. He just took off running, turning down blind alley after blind alley. Lefts and then rights, and then left and right again. It was all in the vain and futile hope that he would be heading away from whatever was pursuing him. He continued checking over his shoulder as he rounded each corner. Moments later he stumbled from the shadows into a pool of lights. He could see signs of light up ahead. He slowed his pace and caught his breath. He found himself in the middle of a late-night market that was just closing up. It was just north of Taipei main station, putting it more than 4 miles from where he had parked his van. He noticed that most of the vendors near him were giving a strange look. He just froze. Then he realized that they were all trying to sell their leftovers before closing up for the night. He walked up to the nearest vendor and without looking just pointed, saying, "Na san gege," indicating 3 of whatever the man was hawking. He was quickly presented with 3 card sticks with some very obliviously deep-fried balls on them. The vendor held up 3 fingers as to indicate 300 Taiwan dollars. He looked up at the man's sign as he reached into his pocket. Squid balls was displayed clearly up there. Cool was his only thought. Squid balls were his favorite night market snack. He squeezed on some fake wasabi paste from a condiment bottle, nodded and smiled at the vendor as he walked away. He entered another alley, hoping to cut across 2 blocks to the taxi stand for the train station. He was looking over his shoulder when he tripped and face planted right into a dark puddle of murky, what he was hesitant to consider, water. When he rolled out of the puddle, he could hear a deep growling and was looking into an inhuman pair of eyes just inches from his face. The black dog that stood in front of him was baring its teeth just a bit. He talked to the animal as if it was a little person, and in very soft tones, he explained that it was an accident and he was very sorry. The dog was black as night with just a little span of white across its eyes like a mask. The animal seemed mildly placated, and as the hunter stood up, it just stood there looking expectantly at him. Reaching down, he rubbed the top of the dog's head and continued talking to him. The dog started to playfully maneuver, trying to get a full body rub out of the encounter. This went on for more than was probably wise, so the hunter stood and started to walk away, but the dog gave an uncertain sound. He turned to look at the animal and it walked up behind him with his dropped bag in its mouth and held it right up to his hand. He could not help but smile at the animal. Wouldn't most dogs just have grabbed the bag and ran, was all he could think. Maybe the animal didn't like wasabi. Just in case this wasn't the situation, he reached in and pulled out 1 stick with 3 of those deep-fried squid balls on them. The dog's ears perked up, or it is more accurate to say the dog's ear and half perked up. Half of its right ear was missing, probably from a street fight when it was much younger. This was not a small animal. He was a large dog and looked well fed. He didn't want to imagine what would like to mess with him now. Luckily it seemed happy to just sit on its haunches with that expectant look on its face. He pulled the balls off the stick and held them in his hand and extended it cautiously to the animal. It leaned in and sniffed, then demurely ate one of the proffered treats. It must have found it acceptable because it took a second, and just as it was about to take the third, it let out a very audible growl, much more ferocious than the one it had made before. The hunter moved his hand away slowly as not to provoke any anonymity. The dog leapt at him and bit firm onto the arm of his jacket, but by some luck only caught the material of his windbreaker, and it started to pull him violently. The animal was dragging him deeper into the dark alley. It was pulling him just as fast as he could keep his feet. Regardless, this animal would have little effort dragged his lifeless core wherever it desired for convenient storage. Just then a cry came up to turn the blood cold. With that, The dog let go of the cheap satin of the windbreaker and his newest chew toy. It put its head up in the air and started sniffing vigorously, and apparently it didn't much like what it smelled. The dog turned and looked at the hunter. It tilted its head in the way dogs do when they encounter a human who is inept. You know the curtains look better on the floor, that space needed a good urine stain, or run you fool. The dog ran past and was halfway down the alley before it noticed that the mentally deficient human was not behind him. The dog ran back to him, and took his sleeve again and pulled insistently. The hunter was still frozen by the sound that came echoing from all directions. The dog took the role of the brains of the group and pulled him into the darkness. Something must have clicked because he began to follow man's best friend around corners and down side streets. A few times, the dog stopped, nearly sending his human companion flying over him. The dog would stop to sniff the air and look towards the sky. Then it would either change direction or go forward a little more cautiously than before. Now, there was a nearly tangible feeling of dread that was growing with each passing minute. Then the dog took a quick right, and down the next alley the hunter could see the familiar yellow of Taipei taxicabs, just 10 yards away. They both went into a full sprint. Halfway, the dog stopped and crouched defensively, sending his human compatriot flying past. Just then all the cabs in sight started to drive away. The man hit the ground in exactly the wrong way to redistribute the force of impact, letting out a deep primal moan that said more than words ever could. He looked at the dog and then at the departing taxis. They just all seemed to pick the same time to leave. He was completely unable to yell for a taxi, the red lights disappeared and his vision went black. The dog's barking became more insistent than ever before, grabbing him by the collar of his windbreaker, pulling him back into the alley. It was only then that he noticed that the darkness before him was rising up in front of him and moving exactly in the way that living things don't. The dog was a few meters away from the shadow, but not nearly far enough for anything resembling comfort. The shadow went into that incredibly disturbing approximation of a crotch. Just then, he grabbed for his weapon and shadows enveloped him. There was no peace and no comfort as he had always imagined. Just the same cold, gut-wrenching fear of a moment before. No heavenly music or harps, just the deepest barking you could ever imagine. It seemed to take you, like a tightness in your chest, and work its way to your ears eventually. He opened his eyes and made the assumption that he was still amongst the living. He just really hated to make assumptions. You know that whole making an ass thing. But as he looked towards the sound of the barking, the dog was standing between him and the shadow. With every one of the animal's deep rumbling cries, the shadow seems to lose its form and start turning into a viscous pool, and in the moment the sound subsided it would start to raise up and start to form into something vile again. The sound went on for an indeterminate time. At some point, the man must have managed to stand, and this made the sound more confusing. The barking was now coming from every direction. Just then, a small brown pug came barreling around the corner and comically hit the wall and kept running a few yards. The small dog seemed to take a deep breath and then join in with the animal mantra. Not as deep as the much larger black dog, but with more heart than you would ever imagine from a stray dog. Other dogs started to show up and they all joined in. There must have been a dozen in no time, all making the same beep repetitive sound as the big dog. They had surrounded it on all sides while keeping a safe distance. Again and again, they would bark and the shadow would lose all cohesion. Then between the bellowing it would start to form up, still obviously disoriented. The big black dog stopped barking and looked at human, and canted its head and just knew he didn't grasp the most obvious of ideas of self-preservation. The other dogs continued to bark, but without the sounds of their apparent leader. The shadow seemed considerably less affected and the disoriented was diminished. The large black dog ran to the man, grabbed him firmly by the sleeve and took off running. At first the pace was slow, and the barking was like a military cadence and they seemed to sync up to the rhythm. The human's right foot seemed to strike the ground on each bark and his left on that moment in between. As they grew further and further from the shadow, the sound of the barking diminished, however, the feeling it made in his chest much less so. The dog kept the man running farther than he had ever run before. It was like he was breathing razor blades and his heart was pumping battery acid. Then a deep sorrowful cry went up, like a dog would make if it was hit by a car. The feeling that the barking raised in his chest was just there, and the next moment it just stopped. Several other yelps of pain came up. The large dog whimpered a little, and then let out a completely different barking sound. Just 3 long deep barks, and then the sound of dogs yelping faded in the distance. The large black dog turned its muzzle towards the human and then back to the sound of dogs in pain and seemed to make up his mind. It grabbed his sleeve and met a strong resistance. It showed long fangs that seemed to have to reason to be in the mouth of a domesticated canine. Those teeth, accompanied by the bass feral growling, left no desire for argument. The running continued for a time that could not be judged. It was just a deep and endless pace until from pure exhaustion he fell to the ground and had to stop. In some faint distant part of his brain, he could hear a sound he must have recognized, but it wasn't until he could raise his head and look around did he figure out that it was the large dog running away. As he stood in the alley, he noticed another page of newsprint had attached itself to his injured foot. Now completely disoriented, he leaned up against the wall, waiting to either die or start breathing normal. A few minutes passed, and he started to survey his surrounding with eyes that stopped bulging with each beat of his heart. Slowly, the world returned to focus. Catching sight of the small van he drove to get here caused him to pick up his pace. He closed the 100 or so yards at a fast trot, and he felt safer just being back at the familiar vehicle. Searching his pockets as he got to the back door of the van, he finally found his keys and opened it. Shaking off the pieces of newspaper, it was returned to the 4 winds, which blew them away in a graceful imitation of flight. Climbing into the van, he was assailed with the odorous smells of fertilizer and flowers. The solid fertilizer was pungent, but he would take this smell any day compared with the other options. Sitting in the van, a feeling of safety washed over him. It could have been the flowers, or the feel of something familiar, or even the increased mobility a vehicle offered. Whatever caused it, the feeling of safety was not slated to last long. A large thud as something landed on the vehicle's roof pretty much knocked the hell out of that false sense of security. The hunter, still in the back of the van, reached over quietly and locked the back door. The click was more felt and less heard in the vehicle. He then reached behind him, and took out the pistol. This time when he dropped the magazine, he caught it in his hand and placed it on the bag of mulch next to him. Pulling the last 7-round clip from his back pocket, he regarded it for a moment. He touched it to his lips and made a silent prayer to that most of abused ideas, the idea of a loving God that will help you smite others. His only solace came from the knowledge that what he wanted to kill was an abomination to the God he believed in. He corrected himself. He did not believe in God, he knew God existed. God may not always be on his side, but the big guy had never been against him. Whatever was on the roof of the van apparently decided to jump off. The leaf sprigs gave a groan and the van recovered with a soft bounce. A dark shadow was being cast through the van's windshield. Sitting on the floor behind the back seat, the dark form could be heard but not seen. The shadow it cast into the van was full of frantic jerks and erratic motions that looked anything but human. Holding the gun in his right hand, he was ready to charge the slide with his left, but for now he just sat. A strange verse from a book by the world's most famous doctor came to his mind and almost made him laugh. All he could do was just sit, 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 and he did not like it, not one little bit. All of a sudden something went bump. Oh, how that bump made him jump. Somehow the hunter managed to stay unmoving like a statue. even as every part of him wanted to jump up and down. He must be going mad. He knew well that this creature could come through the glass without much effort and rip him apart, but he still wanted to laugh. More than laugh, he wanted to see if the creature resembled a 6-foot-tall black and white cat in a red and white striped top hat. Whatever this creature was, it was not like the ones he had just confronted. This one had some mad skills, and he knew if he did not get control of his mind he was done. It took one thought to bring him back to the situation at hand. He snapped out of his state of near-maniacal amusement by just the thought of what he had seen at the morgue only a year ago. The flash of that image removed all humor from his mind and turned his heart to stone. The ripped and mutilated torso of a young woman lay on a cold metal examining table before him. The body was unidentifiable. They had to use her fingerprints. He could be no help in this matter. He was angry for being brought down to see this ghastly sight. Anger was good. Anger worked, for lack of a better word. Anger would get the job done. When he stood over the dead body of his sister, he vowed that he would kill whatever had done this. Had he done that by now, the answer could be yes, only he didn't care. He would kill everyone he could find. Hate, anger, and rage create their own furnace. Contrary to both entropy and the law of diminishing returns, you just seemed to get back more than you put in. Anytime he felt run down, apathetic, or just wanted to have a normal night off and read some Dostoevsky or Joyce, the mental picture of his little sister laying dead on that cold steel slab came back. That is all it took to force him to go on. A wind blew, and the shadow's attention was diverted from the vehicle. It sniffed the wind, and then the disturbing shadow that was cast by the streetlight disappeared. He waited and counted to 10, thinking he possibly counted too fast, so he counted again. This time he did the 1001, 1002 method, all the way up to 1010. Then, just to be on the safe side, he counted to 10 Mississippi, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi 3. He was about to start counting 1 hippopotamus when he felt completely ridiculous and decided to creep out from his hiding place. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, and on the count of 10 hippopotami he emerged around the side of the single bench seat in the back of the van. 2 blocks down the street, he could just see the stairs leading down to the bar he had just left. He stayed crouched behind the seat, noting there were now 2 black sedans parked in front of the bar. Out of an alley, a shape like a man moved into the light. It jumped, leapt, and finally landed like a creature that spent its life on all fours. The dark form stood up straight as it grabbed what it was after. It had a piece of newspaper and brought the fluttering sheets to its face. Then, throwing it away in frustration, it let out a disturbing shriek. It stopped moving and the hunter struggled to see as it faded into the shadows near the sedans. Reaching into an inner pocket, the hunter took out a digital camera, and he flicked the switch to video, and touched the button to make it record. He sat half hidden, as the dark figure seemed to hover around the cars. It snapped too, as a number of other figures came out of the bar and took to the street. This was something new. They moved in tactical formation, scanning windows, doorways, and vehicles with their scopes. Not to mention the high-powered weapons the scopes were attached to. After the 6 had secured the area, one of them raised a hand and signaled towards the pub. 2 more shadowy forms came out of the bar with a third slumping figure carried between them. The door to the car was opened and the unmoving form was whisked in. The door was closed as the vehicle sped away. The remaining men swept the street one last time, then piled into the last car. Loud music filled the van and the hunter jumped. He looked frantically for the source of the incredibly irritating voice of a pubescent Asian singer. The high-pitched Chinese ranting about love came from the black duffel bag. The foreigner dropped the digital camera, and ripped the bag open. The flashing lights revealed the location and source of the disturbance as soon as the zipper was opened. The battery was ripped from the phone quickly, as were all the others, and silence reluctantly returned. The last man, who was about to get into the car, hesitated for just a moment. He looked down the street. He looked right at the van, or at least that is how the hunter felt, got in, closed the door, and the vehicle departed. Cursing the combination of bad luck and his own stupidity, he retrieved the camera from the floor of the van and documented the exodus of the vehicles. Sunrise would be at 5:27 today, but with the thick dome of pollution that hung over the city, the Sunday may not be visible at all. He crunched the numbers and factors, and restlessly palmed the keys to the van. The buses start running at 5:30, and the parking tickets start being issued around 6:30. So he thought 5:45 would be a good time to make a getaway, or sooner, if the police showed up. Not knowing if there were any eyes still out looking for people fleeing the area, he waited. He wanted a little more action on the street before he tried to leave. Waiting was never easy, but in this case it was the best option. Regardless, he hated waiting like this. Reminding himself, he might have been watched was all he could do just to stop himself from bolting. The vehicle traffic had started up. Glimpsing at his watch every 5 minutes was not helping his anxiety. He overcame the need to check the time every 5 minutes with discipline and self-control. Now each time he checked his watch, 6.5 minutes had passed. Crawling under the seat, he reached up and put the keys in the ignition. Looking and waiting, he could see a little out the side view mirror of the van. He could not yet see what he needed, so he waited some more. The drone of the buzzer that let you know the keys are in the ignition was too loud and got on his nerves. In his excited state, the noise was like a drill burrowing deep into his brain. He could not take the sound anymore. He took the keys out after a minute and cursed for a while. Finally, he saw what he was waiting for in the passenger side mirror of the van. A city bus was driving up the street towards him. It seemed to be moving so slowly that he thought it would never arrive. After an incredibly long time, he could hear its engine. And moments later it was about to roll by. The big bus drove past, and he slid the keys in the ignition and turned them. The van's starter motor grinded once and nothing, it grinded twice and a spark of life could be felt. He kept going, and the third revolution of the starter resulted in the motor kicking a bit. Damn it, the bus was passing and the sound of its large diesel engine was growing distant. He stopped, removed the key and went back to doing nothing. The problem with doing nothing is it's a sure way for you to overanalyze every part of your life. The Chinese call this thinking too much, and it was never encouraged in Asian philosophy. He had been accused of thinking too much many times. Like most accusations, he was guilty of it much more than he was ever accused. It was his Persian flaw. If you are not familiar with the concept, please let me explain. A flaw is woven into every true Persian carpet. A very small intentional mistake is included in every rug. The idea is only God can make something perfect, so a mistake is weaved in to state that man was never perfect. In the hunter's mind, the very idea was flawed. If making something perfect makes you a god, then if you could do something perfectly you were a god, and the intentional mistake did not change a thing. He argued that no matter how beautiful a creation was, it was never truly perfect. The very idea that man could ever do anything perfectly was the sin of pride. If you include a mistake so something is not perfect, it is a statement that you could do it perfectly and that was your sin. When this topic was discussed in his class, the resulting debate went on for over 3 hours. This was just one small example of how bad an idea it was for him to be idle for too long. Taking time to review your actions is a type of damnation all its own. You are punished by ideas, like should have, or could have, and the worst one of all is if. No matter how many times you run through what you did, you can never know what would have happened if. Once you start down the path of if, then if will become your life. If is only a small part of life, you should never let it take over or control your life. That is what Father Bellamida always said. This may not be ancient Catholic wisdom, The good father may have picked it up from a movie or two. The time had come again, and he started turning the key when the bus was a full length away. After 2 turns the van's engine came to life. It only took a moment of calculation to decide he still had time to go. He jumped into the seat and dropped the automatic transmission into gear. He drove at a slow speed, accelerating until he was pacing the bus. He did this for half a block, and made a right turn down one of Taipei's very strange systems of alleys. The smaller streets created countless secret little communities inside of the city. No 2 areas were remotely similar, each had its own gods, temples, shops, culture, and even its own gangsters. Turning down the wrong alley at the wrong time could be a serious mistake. However, at this time of night he thought the odds were in his favor. He turned right again, hoping to get back to the main street, heading in the right direction. He slammed on the brakes and slid to a stop, just inches from the car that was blocking the alley. At this point the possibility that he had miscalculated this decision occurred to him. Excerpt from the GHASD travel tip number 3, meeting the locals and making new friends. In the dance, making friends is best done with the use of dismembered body parts and a few stray bolts of lightning. If the Baron von Frankenstein method of social networking appeals to you, there is no need for you to read any further. Congratulations, find the nearest rip in the pallium and jump in. For the others, it is best to treat any new friends with a pinch, or even better, a fistful of salt. You may also wish to try holy water, crucifixes, machete, a 12-gauge and a few hand grenades if you really want to be sure. There are many types of creatures of the pallium. What we will focus on are the ones that seem to be attracted to its outskirts, primarily on our sides. These are commonly referred to as the damned. Some people say there are 7 classes of damned, and yet others insist that the damned are as widely varied as gods of Hinduism. We will explore this topic in later chapters, though we will not get into it too deeply right now. It is fair to say that if you give them any opportunity, the damned will devour your body and soul.